A prominent U.S. lawmaker has been denied access to a man who was wrongly deported to El Salvador. Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen was in the Central American country to push for the release of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. The Trump administration sent him to El Salvador without evidence that he had committed a crime. Critics are warning that El Salvador is becoming a, quote, black hole for U.S. deportees.
Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case has become a rallying point for critics of the Trump government's deportation policies. The White House previously admitted that Kilmar was wrongfully deported, but the Attorney General poured cold water on the idea of him returning.
He is not coming back to our country. President Bukele said he was not sending him back. That's the end of the story. If he wanted to send him back, we would give him a plane ride back. There was no situation ever where he was going to stay in this country. None.
The Attorney General's words came ahead of a trip to El Salvador by US Senator Chris Van Hollen, who represents Kilmar's state of Maryland.
The goal of this mission is to let the Trump administration, to let the government of El Salvador know that we are going to keep fighting to bring Abrego Garcia home until he returns to his family. I hope to meet with representatives of the government. I hope to have the chance to actually see Kilmar and see what his condition is.
Kilmar Abrego Garcia is being kept here at CCOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center, a 40,000 capacity mega prison in a remote part of El Salvador. Human rights groups say abuses are routine here, including beatings, deprivation of food and medicine, and torture. Not long after arriving in El Salvador, Senator Van Hollen met with the country's vice president, but was denied a meeting or a phone call with Kilmar. The senator then levelled a question at the vice president.
Why is El Salvador continuing to hold him in CCOT? And his answer was that the Trump administration is paying El Salvador, the government of El Salvador, to keep him at CCOT.
The fight for Kilmar's return continues with a possible showdown looming between the government and the courts.
Let's bring in Muzaffar Chishti, a lawyer at the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome to DW. What do you make of this whole case as a migration lawyer?
Well, thanks for having me. First of all, this is obviously just becoming a very important standoff between the executive and the judiciary, and we are testing the limits of the rule of law in our country. This has become more problematic because the Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision last week that the government should facilitate his return to the United States. But it also gave a lot of leeway to the government by saying to the judge that you must have due deference to executives' sort of authority in foreign affairs. So that's sort of where we are in this ambiguity, whether the administration is actually following the directives of the court or not.
And what about this contempt of court claim? How serious is that?
I think that's where the stage we're in. The judge yesterday asked the lawyers for Mr. Abrego to give questions that should be asked of the administration, and the judge has essentially given them 2 weeks to respond. I think then the judge is expected to call people to the court so they could be testified, cross-examined by lawyers for Mr. Abrego Garcia, and at the end of that, if the judge or they decide not to show up for the hearing, that will be a contempt of the court. And then the issue would be, how do you execute contempt? Do you give them monetary sanctions? Do you even threaten to jail them? That's sort of where the new sort of pool of this courts issuing orders and whether they go into appeal all the way back to the Supreme Court.
Could it all lead to a constitutional crisis?
Well, there's no definition of a constitutional crisis, so we're all trying to struggle what that would be. The flip side of the coin would be that if the judge orders the executive to do something in foreign policy, which the judiciary has no authority to, that itself is a constitutional crisis. But I think the focus here is that if there is a direct order of the Supreme Court to bring this person back, which hasn't happened as yet, and the administration refuses to obey, then we're getting very close to a constitutional crisis.
And tell me, what's it mean for migration policy? I mean, I bet there are a lot of migrants in the US asking themselves, what happens if I get deported, if I get sent back? What about foreign students who are being sent back right now over infringements, traffic infringements, very, very small crimes? And in this case, we don't even know what the crime is, really, do we?
Yeah, I think in this case, the question here is that people can be deported for all kinds of reasons. The issue is that do they get due process of the law before they're deported? In this case, the person was deported against the order of a judge who had withheld his deportation to El Salvador. So the fact that due process was not complied is the question. In other students' cases, we haven't seen the end of those cases. If the due process is applied in those cases and people are removed, then there's not much one can argue against. So this case has sort of gone the most, has garnered the most attention because it sort of reminds people that maybe people could be deported to other countries and kept outside the jurisdiction. And the specter, therefore, has raised that could even apply to U.S. citizens. Look, if you're sent abroad and you say outside the U.S. Jurisdiction, does that sort of become a really bad precedent for other immigrants and even for U.S. citizens?
And just briefly, if you were Abrego Garcia's lawyer, how do you think this will end for him? What would you say to him?
It's very hard to say because, I mean, if I knew, I would be in the betting market. We don't know how it will end. I think there is some minor likelihood that he may be returned back just because the Trump administration may not want to test the limits of its resistance to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court giving a 9-0 opinion on this was a signal to the administration that you have to really tread carefully. But I think if it is brought back, there's a good chance that he might be sent back to another country, if not El Salvador.
Okay. Interesting insights there from lawyer Muzaffar Chishti. Thank you very much for being on DW.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's go over now to Benjamin Alvarez Gruber. He has more on this, our correspondent in Washington. Benjamin, what's going to happen next?
That's a good question. There's so many layers here. In the case of Gilmar Abrego Garcia is just one of so many cases of those men, the deportees that the Trump administration deported to El Salvador using this Alien Enemies Act of 1798. When this first plane carrying a big group of deportees flew down from the U.S. to El Salvador, there was a court that ordered the White House to turn around the plane, something that the administration declined to do. So now there is a federal judge that is saying that he found probable cause to hold President Trump's administration in criminal contempt of court for violating this order. So we have this district judge who warns that he could refer this matter for prosecution if the administration does not purge its contempt. And that could be, for example, returning those who were sent to this prison in El Salvador to the U.S., so return them back here. And if we look at the case of Abrego Garcia, it was the Supreme Court of the United States that ruled that the U.S. government must facilitate the return of this man from Maryland, the citizen that was mistakenly deported to El Salvador. But the White House is now trying to shift the narrative, saying that the government actually has no measures to send him back to the United States.
This story just keeps getting bigger. What are Abrego Garcia's chances now of actually being returned?
So before even thinking about a return, he should actually be able to talk. If it's Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, who we just saw there, who wanted to talk to him, but was denied that. So there would be actually to see him, to see what his status is in this prison. We have the House Democrats now urging the U.S. Attorney General to actually reinstate the attorney who was sidelined after acknowledging that the Trump administration made a mistake by deporting Gilmar Abrego Garcia in the first place.
Ben, I also wanted to ask you, the administration says he was a gang member. Is there evidence for this?
Attorney General Pam Bondi today uploaded a document that is the Prince George County Police Department gang field interview sheet. This was back in 2019 when he was detained. And I would just like to quote a couple of sentences there, because it says, during the interview, officers observed that he was wearing a Chicago Bull hat and a hoodie with rolls of money covering the eyes, ears and mouth of the president on the separate denominations. Officers know such clothing to be indicative of the Hispanic gang culture. And it continues, wearing the Chicago Bulls hat represents that they are a member in good standing with the MS-13. Officers contacted a past, proven and reliable source of information who advised Gilmar Armando Abrego Garcia as an active member of MS-13 with the West End's clique. I just leave it there. I just wanted to quote out of this document that the Attorney General Pam Bondi uploaded today. So it's understandable that many, not just as lawyers, but many are wanting to have actually more evidence and letting the court and letting the justice decide that, with many fearing that it's actually already a constitutional crisis with the administration, with the executive of President Donald Trump, ignoring a Supreme Court order that said that Washington needs to facilitate the return of this man back to the United States.
Yeah, what happened to leaving it up to the courts? Benjamin Alvarez Gruber, thank you very much for the update.